When any new project arrives, you have to look at the climate situation, just like you look at the landscape situation or whatever. I mean, some architects, you get the same result, whatever the climate or wherever the building is. But we like to feel that climate very much shapes our buildings, and the landscape or the setting of the building often dictates the shape of the building. One example, for instance, when we did the British Pavilion in Seville, which was based on energy, it's pretty well the hottest city in Europe, Seville. So our idea was to harness the sun to cool the building. So we had solar cells on the roof, louvers with solar cells collecting energy on the roof of the building, and built a solid wall facing west as a complete barrier to the sun and to stabilize the temperature in the building. We sheltered the east and west facades with fabric louvers. So, in fact, we made sure that the sun never actually touched the building at all. It was completely sheltered and protected.
Well, we are living in an era of global warming, climate change. The climate is changing rapidly. We can no longer just rely on the old idea of local climate. Of course, every authentic piece of architecture or city planning is based on a genius loci, on a place, its topography, its history, its people, and its weather. And of course, that is a main factor in designing a building. You cannot design a building from the north and the south, or a building from the south and the north. That doesn't make any sense. But as I'm indicating, with global weather change, we have to really look at other criteria, because we're living in a crisis era. It's an era of a war against the planet Earth. Some have called it the Anthropocene. Every project, I've worked in the north, I worked in the south, in Africa, in the east. Every work has to relate itself deeply to the climate. I'm working in Africa, in Kenya, in Turkana, that has a desert climate. I'm working in Finland, close to the North Pole, that has Nordic European climate. So, of course, every building material, every choice that you make of how to conserve energy, how to make smart buildings that are responsive to the environment, it's a challenge.
Well, my work is ecological architecture. So one of the most major determinants of ecology is climate, because different climates in the world influence the type of species or flora and fauna of that locality. It also, in the same way it influences the flora and fauna, it influences the architecture and human beings as well. Design with climate means you start with passive mode, means improve conflict conditions without engineering. But the next level is what I call mixed mode, in some engineering, not an awful lot of engineering. So that by using mixed mode, there's a technique to extend the mid-seasons, both into the summer and into winter. So in this way, mixed mode is a way of reducing energy consumption of the building. And then, of course, then comes full mode, which is full air conditioning, heating, and so forth. And then after full mode will be what I call productive mode, which is where your building becomes a power station by itself. It generates its own energy. And so climate starts at the baseline.
I think local climate has always influenced buildings, and I would say always has influenced great architecture. The question is the interesting phenomena since the Industrial Revolution is that there's probably like a strand of buildings that have developed, and probably they had their peak in modernism, where buildings could actually ignore the local climate and still be buildings. But today, as we do know, I think all good architecture today must respond to the local climate. The truth is that probably some of us quite enjoy a lot of transparency, which I would always defend, because you want to, you spend so much time indoors, so we want to have glass, but the thermal performance of the glass is always a challenge, and it is a challenge in winter and in summer. I would say that it has shaped most of the project that we've been working on for the last few decades. This constant struggle of, I want to enjoy the great view out, but you have to respond to the climate, and especially, as I say, the sun and the cold nights of wintertime.
Siempre hay que consultar a la naturaleza. De ella recibimos mucha información sobre el clima, la temperatura, el aire, su dirección, su velocidad, el tiempo de insolación o de asoleamiento y cuál debiera ser el mejor emplazamiento. Naturalmente que involucramos una serie de juguetes en computadoras, simuladores, para simular, como lo acabo de decir, simular cómo se está comportando el edificio antes de construirse, adelantarnos a su comportamiento. Esto nos ha permitido desarrollar en la oficina un método propio que le llamamos el método Dynamo, donde prácticamente el inductor se refiere precisamente a toda la información que proviene de la naturaleza, las condiciones del clima. El inducido es la forma arquitectónica, cómo la estamos resolviendo a partir de implementar sistemas pasivos de climatización natural. Y por último, el sistema captador, que es cuando ya estamos involucrando sistemas activos, sistemas mecánicos y, por supuesto, la implementación de energías renovables para la generación de energía.
As you can imagine, I get asked this a lot. In my role as environmental engineer for Foster's, we tend to look at climates all over the world in some of the most unusual places and in some quite particular climates. And I think without doubt, I can't imagine a building where we haven't responded, sometimes with form, sometimes with shape. It depends. We've forever looking at ways to harness as much of the climate as we can, and therefore the actual positioning of a building on a site, so it could be as insignificant as orientation or as significant as actually transforming a form to respond to a certain type of either solar exposure, wind exposure, rain catchment, solar yield from generation. It's always influencing everything we do. So we will always respond, and I always have in my experience of working in environmental design since the beginning. That's been a focus part of my effort.
I mean, there are quite a lot of examples in nature which I have used. The wing of a dragonfly is almost transparent, transparent skin, slightly opaque, but lets in a lot of daylight. And it would be wonderful to have a sort of framework building where the cladding of it was actually alive and growing and changing over the seasons. So you can have skins which can be tuned up like a piano, opened and closed, and letting in more ventilation or less, or that kind of thing. With the Eden project, for instance, we studied the structure of butterfly wing or a dragonfly wing, and how the structure often formed into a hexagon, and which nest very well together. And when they come to a solid barrier of some sort. It's very interesting how the hexagons open out and always hit it at right angles. Nature deals with structures. It's absolutely fantastic. The root structure of a tree echoing the structure above the ground. A good structure, you can trace the load from the outer part of the structure through the building and down to the ground. You won't find structures in nature which aren't extremely efficient and effective any more than you will in a, for instance, a sailing boat, which I always like to say, you know, they're beautiful because I'm a sailor, but boats are beautiful because they're functional, and then you won't find a single item on a yacht which is actually there for decoration. It's extreme efficiency, which is very nice to see.
My work is 100% influenced by the ecology of the environment. Ecology is the environmental biology of nature, and so our work is influenced by the attributes and properties of ecosystems. The principles I'm working on now is how to design buildings that imitate the attributes and properties of ecosystems, and if possible, we could even replicate it, because if our buildings imitate and replicate ecosystems, then they become part of nature. We do not have any dislocation between our built environment and the natural environment, which is what's happening now. And so nature influences what we do 100%. Now, nature has limitations. Has what you call levels of resilience. What is our attitude to nature? And that's what we need to inculcate in people, a respect for the ecology of the environment. And so when you talk about climate change and impairment, it comes down to people. What is our attitude towards nature? What is our ideology and mindset towards nature? And that's what we need to change.
Nature itself does not really exist. We've created an erroneous concept of a nature that comes from some biblical or mythological Greek sources. But we know that there is no such nature, and that this nature is also dependent on micro dynamics of cells, of particles, of the DNA. And so these are really vast questions. How will architecture really move forward into the future? What are the challenges that are coming in our sphere, in our Anthropocene, and how will we actually survive? It's more than a question of adaptation. It's really more critically a question of survival. We assume we will survive, but that assumption is really might be illusory if we don't act on our environment, if we don't act politically to change the attitude to the city and to how we live, if we don't use the solidarity of human beings around the planet, the notion of sustainability, and that is memory. We can say that nature is one of the oldest memories we have, sealed not only in texts, but in spaces and in places around the planet Earth. And so I think memory might be the fundamental dimension of nature and of sustainability.
I walk a lot. I run a lot. I run a lot in the countryside, and I've always loved that experience of going from a windswept or sun-baked openness to passing through a forest and feeling that climatic transition. And I think, if anything, and it's probably more public space influence than enclosed buildings, if you like, I think that's probably the strongest link. I'm not a big fan of placing nature indoors. I don't think it's its natural habitat. It's never something I've been too excited about. But I do like the concept of urban or public spaces in an urban context, where you can use nature or even man-made elements to do what nature does, where it shades and it causes a different climatic under some form of either covering or wind shelter or solar shelter or whichever climate you're in. So in summary, the part of nature that I find the strongest influence is the one that where you use an equivalent in man-made or otherwise obtained materials that are used in assembly in a way that mimics what nature can do to transform a climate in a location. And it's very local.
Bueno, la naturaleza siempre es un punto de partida. En especial, la piel y el funcionamiento en los sistemas de organismos vivos. Y han sido dos los que nos han gustado mucho. Uno, lo que es la mantarraya, la forma aerodinámica que tiene, prácticamente es un planeador acuático. Y esto lo transformamos en el diseño de algunos edificios, en su piel, en cubiertas, en fachadas. Estas mismas branquias pueden ser manejadas en fachadas. El otro animal, que es más bien del reino de los insectos, son aquellos que tienen un exoesqueleto. Esto también nos ha ayudado al diseño de envolventes arquitectónicas para ser traducida como un exoesqueleto. Por ejemplo, una casa donde prácticamente la estructura es la que está sosteniendo toda la casa. También lo que es el exoesqueleto de una torre de departamentos. Finalmente, la naturaleza sigue siendo este detonador para la inspiración y para la forma arquitectónica.
I think almost everything that I enjoy doing is actually, in one way or another, a response to nature. I personally love the whole exploration of, biomimetics and structures and bone structures, and as an office we spend a huge amount of time exploring how bones, if you cut a bone, how the bone structure works and how nature builds things. I'm actually most interested in human beings as animals and our needs and desires to be in contact with nature. And it's biophilia, the man's desire to be one with nature through comfort conditions. How can you actually create architecture that brings people, maybe not back to nature, but brings nature to them? Because the truth is we probably missed the boat of going back to nature. I think the cities should be as human as possible, discuss. I want a city where I can walk, where I can cycle, where there are trees on the street, and I can see my children walking along.